So this is our third session with Regis McKenna, talking about his distinguished career, and we're going to talk today about that period in the early to mid-70s when Regis was starting his company and growing it very rapidly through that early period. And we'll also focus today on his the beginning of his long and very successful relationship with Intel and its executives. So thank you, Regis.
You're welcome, John.
We had just started talking at the end of the last session about how you started your company, and we won't have to go back over that, but I did want to ask you if it felt risky at the time to be striking out on your own and trying to set up the business as you envisioned it.
Certainly my wife did think it was risky. We really didn't have a lot of money saved, particularly after moving to California and trying to, again, people complained about the cost of housing here, and even rents were very high and so forth. So, and when you're starting out, you're not making an enormous amount of money. But it was sort of the idea of taking the risk. I felt quite comfortable in that if I didn't do that, I'd be able to get a job somewhere. So I didn't, there was a lot of growth in the area. There were a lot of new companies starting. There were existing companies that I knew, and I knew some of the people in them, and I felt comfortable myself in taking the step.
You talked about how you got the first two companies that helped you launch. What happened after that?
Well, I think once I got started and started, actually, we were doing everything that was done in what was called marketing services, which was the advertising and so forth. There wasn't really a concept of PR. Public relations was you put a photograph of the product on the front of a data sheet and you mail it to editors and let them worry about how to write up the product. And so it really wasn't this sort of idea of, is this a significant product? How does it fit in the context? How does it fit in the, in the competitive environment at the present time? And so that was really, I think, where we started innovating, which was one of the very early things that started was called a backgrounder. And it was getting editors, journalists, freelance journalists, to write the background story of the company. Who are they? How did they start? And what are their objectives and goals? And what are they heading towards? And really mailing that out so that the journalist had some background when they would start seeing these companies start to appear on the either in the press releases or so forth. And every company started doing that later on. But I patterned it after an Analyst report. I would tell the writer, you want to really minimize the adjectives, minimize the superlatives. The companies want to say the best, the greatest, the first, all those kind of things. And having come out of the journalistic world, they didn't believe any of that anyway. So it would be far better to go in with a little humility and present the company and the products in a factual manner.
How did the companies receive that advice?
Oh, at least the first companies, I think they were willing to do whatever we suggested. Or, it was mainly me, so it was, me, I suggested. I had enough experience, and they knew the success of National's growth and success was pretty positive. And I had references from Spork and Valentine and others at the company, so I don't think, it wasn't, they didn't throw me out, they didn't fire me. I left on my own, and they were still remained actually pretty good friends.
How much of your time in the early days did you have to spend on just acquiring new clients, just simply growing the business?
It actually just kept going. I mean, I have Don Heffler wrote one of his newsletters. He wrote the whole newsletter on my company that we had within the first year we had 9 semiconductor companies as clients. So there really wasn't something that would sort of manage everything that the people were doing and try to do not just get stuff out, but get it out in a unique way that created some differentiation. And Spork once said that that at National I had helped create at least the perception that National was much more successful and bigger than they were, and it was because they got a fair amount of unfair amount of attention, and that was really personal contacts with the journalist world, and that didn't happen in those days. It was mainly done through wire services or through sending them press releases.
I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about that, Regis, because that was a uniquely Regis thing, I think, that you did. There's a phrase, in fact, you will talk about that, I'm sure, the Regis Touch. And one of the aspects, it seems to me, of the Regis Touch was your commitment to building these personal relationships with journalists and editors and people who were opinion makers. And that's not easy to do because, as you said, they're inherently skeptical. They know that you're representing companies, a point of view, a commercial interest, and yet you were able to do that in a way that actually it helped everyone. It helped them, it helped the companies. Talk about how you first came to that as an approach you knew was important, and then the whole process of going about doing that.
Well, and they were skeptical of West Coast startup companies.
Yeah, it was that dimension too,
which was maybe the biggest obstacle. Well, I have to again thank Don Valentine. I mentioned all the freedom that he gave me, and I don't think a lot of people in my role or position at the time were given the budget and the freedom to do that sort of thing, is to explore, to make early, forays into New York and into London and into other centers in Europe, and to just knock on doors and go say, hi, I'm from National at the time, or I'm from my own company now, and here are my clients. And I wouldn't pitch them. I wouldn't give them a sales pitch. I just wanted to introduce myself and have a general talk about what's going on in the Valley. And the stories are always greater and much more interested in the journalists as to the sort of worldview rather than down into literally the chips. The chips didn't really give them a lot of excitement, particularly in the 60s and 70s. But when you started talking about the total amount of business that was created by the semiconductor industry, the percentage growth, and I would bring charts, I would bring lots of things to show them what was going on in a particular industry or technology. So it just raised it above something that wasn't just pitching a little picture on a page that nobody could see or understand what it was. They were much more interested, and that took a number of years, and it wasn't until some years later that the business press got hold of it. But I had been calling on, Business Week and Fortune and Forbes and Time Magazine and Morgan Stanley Analysts and that sort of thing for some years, and just knew them well. Valentine said to me one time, and he saw it as a sales kind of thing, and he actually used to get upset with salesmen who didn't have enough dinners with customers on their expense accounts. Because he said, if you have a free evening, there's always customers around, and you can exchange more information. In fact, Peter Drucker said that. There's more business information that is transferred over lunch or dinner, more business is conducted over lunch and dinner than any other time of the day. And that's absolutely true. So many of the journalists and analysts who worked in New York, and it was primarily the publishers were all in New York, didn't go home till late anyway because of they live out in the suburbs somewhere. So they would stay in New York until, after 7 or 8. So to have dinner was, was something that I pursued too. So when I set up my appointments, I'd do it at the end of the day, and then we'd go to dinner. And you talk about everything from, family and what's going on in the world, politics, everything. And in the meantime, you could talk about the companies you're working with and what you're doing and so forth. I think a couple of the rules that I followed was always be honest, even whenever they said, we hear, you're not shipping a certain product. I would say, sure, that's true. Because they would find out anyway. And so you had to be, it's being more comfortable in your own shoes, because the company's management wants you to always get a good story, and the media always wants you to be truthful. And
that's a hard gap to close.
Yes, and I think it's the biggest issue why people don't trust public relations, because they represent the company as almost as a sales arm in too many instances. And so it was something that, but at the time, that's where I had to make money, and I did it my way.
And you had another philosophy that you've talked about, which is to aim high, meaning that you only went for the blue chip publications, Time, the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, the real opinion shapers. How did you find that fit with this honesty philosophy that you're talking about?
Well, even more so, because they were interested in the financial success of the company. They wanted to know the credentials of the people that were the managers. They wanted to know about the processes that go on within the company in terms of how you're organized, how you're managed, how you're expanding internationally. I also felt that part of the change started occurring when you started taking the senior executives back to New York. They began to say, these people are pretty bright. These people know what they're doing. And they're quite frankly, all of the people that we sort of were seeing out here in the top of these companies, even companies that didn't succeed in the long run, they were very, very intelligent and sharp people. And they were also always very articulate. They could stand up in front of the customer or stand up in front of a conference and be quite confident in what they were saying and knowledgeable. So they could do that, to analysts and others as well. They needed the analysts because they started raising money very early. And so that expanded my world beyond the PR and the journalism into the analyst world.
And did you find that the New York crowd was surprised about what they were learning about what was going on out here on the West Coast?
It took a while. I mean, it certainly didn't do it automatically. There were a few people who had been covering technology and wanted to cover technology. A lot of the gurus that we see, like for example in the PC industry today, were formerly journalists who got hooked on PCs and started analyzing every PC that came out, and suddenly they became an expert on that subject because they covered them all. But then they left that and started doing conferences and so forth just on PCs. The most knowledgeable one by far was Ben Rosen. And Ben was a semiconductor analyst at Coleman and Company, I think was the first one he was at. And he wrote a semiconductor newsletter that he put out, I think, once a month. And Ben was a physicist and came from a family of well-educated technical people. And yet he was a financial analyst. And so people really did sort of hang on his words. Customers did. And he would be very forthright in analyzing the products. And that sort of gave him a platform to do other things. And then he would hold semiconductor conferences. And and the interesting thing about these semiconductor conferences is when you would go to them, it was only company presidents or senior executives there. It wasn't marketing people. It wasn't PR people. It wasn't outside that. It was really pretty. I attended his first PC conference in New York, and it was in his conference room, which was a very small room, and it was the presidents of all of the startup companies in the PC business in the country, and Ben could command their attention, and then he started doing the PC newsletter, and but he also started using the PC. So he had the Mac on his desk, was one of the first ones. He had the Apple II on his desk using it. So I'm jumping ahead, but that really revolutionized the media, because the media began using the products that they were writing about, and that changed everything. The microprocessor came close because they could get lots of applications, and there were applications that were real world applications, blood analyzers, toys, automobiles, things of that nature. So suddenly they had something tangible to point to and use as a reference model. And but the PC changed everything.
I want to go. We're going to spend a lot of time on the PC era. I want to cycle back just for a minute though onto how you went about educating yourself, Regis, because you really do believe in research and reading and continuous learning. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit. You gave me the cover pages out of a number of books that were very influential to you early on. One of the main ones is this book by Robert Bartels in 1962, The Development of Marketing Thought. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that book and its concepts and the influence that it had on you as you were going through this whole process of self-development.
Yeah, and I think it had more influence as we got more under our belt, probably late 70s. And the thing that was most impressive when I read that book was that if you were a marketer in the 1940s or 50s, or you were in the marketing department of a company, more than likely you had an economics background. And it was the economics and the understanding of distribution and logistics that actually enabled them to look at how to change product pricing, how to move into the marketplace in a unique way by either building real estate or by building sales forces, and always looking at the economics of the product. And it was really that kind of early training that led to the brand managers at Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble was one of the first companies to actually buy a fleet of cars and where people went out as salespeople into these small towns across America. And that was a revolution right there in terms of going out and getting their products packaged and placed in grocery stores across the country, small ones. And so it was really understanding how the psychology of the marketplace, the nature of the buyer, the economic ability of the consumer. It was through that came credit, retail credit. So every department store, my mom, when we'd go shopping in downtown Pittsburgh she'd buy clothes and that sort of thing. She had a credit card for every, for Gimbels and Kaufmann's and all of them. There was Horns. All of them had their separate credit cards, and that is what enabled people in America to acquire goods and then pay, 50 cents a month for the rest of their lives to fill up their house with goods. And but it really started creating demand for product. And up until that time, most of the economists and national and international were promoting supply side economics. That the more you built, the more you would sell. And it was just the opposite. It's the more people bought, the more you would make. And so, the whole idea of having economists at the base of marketing made an awful lot of sense to me. And I thought, we have to be smarter in marketing than to simply look at the traditional ways of doing things.
And it also, it seems to me, carried the message that to really do marketing, you had to understand the business from end to end in the context of a larger economy. It was a way. I mean, I was always impressed with your tagline for your company. The ad is the last thing we do, and I didn't really understand it until you and I started talking, and I learned about why that was.
Well, the more you advertise a bad product, the faster you go out of business. That's the other the other part of the tagline, and I witnessed that firsthand. I mean, I saw this at various companies where, they would want to promote right away, and they would start thinking that ads would solve their problem, but they don't. And I saw that back when I was in the ad business, selling ads, that companies really would run an ad thinking that this would build their product. And it didn't. It was it could have been the technology was not the right technology. It could be the pricing wasn't correct. Could be longer term relationships from competitors. Could be the service was bad. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong that can destroy a product in the marketplace. But if you just keep pushing it out there, it won't sell. And so, as I said, the more you advertise a bad product, faster you go out of business.
As the agency began to grow in the early days, you had to think about the culture of the company just the way every startup CEO has to think about it. How did you think about that, and what did you want the culture of your company to be?
Well, again, that took a little bit of time to really to develop. The first few years, you're surviving, so you take on all more business than you can handle, just because you want to keep the cash flow. You're hiring people, and we were hiring very rapidly, and so I wouldn't say that you immediately go into that. Although I will say that I was going to night class all that time in the early days, about the first 5 years of my company. I went to San Jose State, and I went to De Anza, and just took courses on all sorts of things.
What were you doing what kinds of classes were you taking at night?
At San Jose State, I took some philosophy classes. I took a physics course. I took literature and writing. Things like that. Yeah. I just wanted to keep into the academic mode in my mind, and I think that helped a lot in terms of wanting to look for ways to educate my own people as well as my clients. Mm-hmm. And I would aside from that, I would say that I subscribed, as I mentioned before, to a lot of different magazines. I have a article from the early Wall Street Journal in here, and then I would write on my clients' names on them, staple a tag to it, and then my assistant would mail them out to Steve Jobs and Bob Noyce and people like that.
And you circulate a lot internally too, didn't you? Clipping has been an important part of your professional life, just as a way of educating yourself and others. I
have in my office in my home, I have a separate room, which is just a storage room. It's got metal cabinets on one side and three sides. And all one side are metal cabinets that are filled with clippings. I have it on every subject imaginable. U.S. economy, world economy, Japan, microprocessors, artificial intelligence. You name a subject, I probably have a file on it. And I would use those for my own knowledge, and I would use them because in my presentations to the company, we had a lot of training sessions. Once we got above 3 or 4 people, I brought in. I started bringing in, and probably in the late 70s, people from Stanford I got to know, and in the 80s, give lectures to our. We had an office building with a big lecture section in it, and we brought. There was a fellow, and I can't remember his name. I wish I could. His name, I think his name was Bob, and he was a professor at Stanford. Had spent a period of his career at Varian, I think when they were in the computer business, the data machine business, and but he started talking. One of his favorite lectures was, products need not be commodities. There's always a way to add something to a product to turn it into a higher value. Whether it's service, whether it's redesigning it, whether it's adding some additional part or system to it, there are ways to not just satisfy that something is a commodity. And because the chip business, and particularly transistors and others, really look like commodities at the time, then that fascinated me, and he probably was the most frequent visitor and lecturer at our place for some time. And I'm sorry I can't remember his name. It was a lot of years ago.
Well, I would think that would be just as true for agencies at some level, right? I mean, there weren't a lot of competitors in the early days, but certainly later there were, and you had to differentiate the Regis McKenna Group from all the rest of them in some way.
But we did, and it wasn't as easy because people don't want to. If let's say and I used to use this comparison with our own people. If Intel was at once known as a memory company, and even before that, they were a bipolar company. They weren't a MOS company as a process. MOSFETs as a basis of their technology. They will change that, and people will just accept it as the rise of technology. But in our business, I still get people asking me. I have 2 people wanting right now that just have emailed me, asking me to meet with them to talk about, advertising and PR. I still get it, and I mean it's one of these things where they just don't want to shake that image of you, even if you change it. And I did change. I mean, I did change the business because our income, in the late 90s was 100% consulting, strategy consulting, and but it took a long time to get there.
Yeah. In the early days, you mentioned you're just running hard, trying to survive and trying to pick up clients. And getting more work than you could actually handle. Is that the way it happened in that period from, say, 70 to 75?
Yeah, much more work than you can handle, and finding people was really difficult because the traditional people were, they were used to doing sort of the spec sheets and things like that, or they were illustrators or graphics people out of San Francisco ad agencies. And so what kind of people do you hire? And so you sort of pepper the people with more technical skills, but you can have some of the others as well. So you would have some very creative people and some very technical people. So the technical people came from hiring journalists out of the trade magazines. So they could write, they understood the products, and they could not only explain it. One of the people that worked for me a few years later was a guy named Rob Brownstein, and he gave a whole series of lectures. In fact, I think they're recorded to our people on basic electronics, and we try to get those people to also teach others and put them together in teams so that there was sort of a more creative and then the more technical people working together. And that became sort of a mode of doing, say, the advertising and or the public relations, where the technical people could make sure that it's technically correct and that it presents the product in a way that's not over promotional, whereas the creative people might look at the ad and say it's not interesting unless we do such and such. We hired a little later on, probably in the early days, a guy named Jerry Lenhart as creative director, and Jerry came out of a big agency in San Francisco. He is responsible for having designed the original Wells Fargo checks and all the Stagecoach stuff he did, and he was very creative, and he used to call the chips bugs, and that's all he called. He said they're bugs. They're not interesting. They're just bugs. So he in one of Intel's ad, he put a huge chicken in the middle, and it was the chicken or the egg, what comes first, and to change your business. And so he started putting really interesting stuff in that still had a meaning. But fellow who was one of the senior technical writers for McGraw-Hill was a guy named George Sedaris, and put George and Jerry together, and they wouldn't fight, but they came close to it.
How did you find these particular people, these really super talented people, and convince them to come to work?
Just through vendors coming in and calling on us and giving reference to them. And in particular, the journalists we knew. I knew a lot of them in New York, and certainly approaching to hire them out of some of the magazines that you wanted to place things in. But there was a little bit of a squeeze play because since we got Intel fairly early, the journalists and the magazines in New York the technical magazines wanted to stay close to them because they knew Noyce and Moore were going to do great things. And so when I hired people out of there, they complained, but not loudly. And they almost all of them became long-term employees for me.
Who were some of the other key hires in the early years?
Well, one of the people who came, I brought 3 people with me from National over in a period of the next year.
Over a period of time.
Yeah, it was my assistant at National, a woman, Myrna Bernard, and she was sort of a jack of all trades, from accounting to tracking everything and production of materials and all that sort of thing. And then Avella, who was also sort of a manager of logistics for all of our, if we did brochures or ads or those kind of things, Dave Takagawa. And those two were really a powerhouse in terms of hardworking, get stuff done, and get the products out. Particularly, there's always everything was for the clients that I had had to be done yesterday, and so and there were time schedules. If you were going to try to make a deadline on a magazine, you had to ship it out a month ahead, and so those were really, really tough schedules, because almost in all cases, I used to say that if it weren't for the ad or for the PR release, these companies would never put a price on their product, because it was pricing was always the last thing to decide, and it took it took a, hey, we got to get this out or we're not going to make a deadline, and that's generally what got them to agree on the final availability and specs and pricing.
And how often were you in on those discussions as well?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah. I mean, you'd be really. I think the interesting is you go through my notes. Particularly, I don't have notes on my days at National, but I was just going through some on Intel, and Ed Gelbach was VP of Marketing, and we were going over the microprocessor market and their products. And he gives me all the monthly sales, what it was last year, the year before, what their production rate was, what the pricing had been, what the income was, what the margins were on the product. So I got a very, very detailed information in the meetings that so they didn't, there was no sort of, we're not going to tell you.
Yeah, of course. And who were well, let me back up. How did the company grow so quickly? What was it you were doing that made you more in demand than anyone else?
I think it was that we had some understanding of their business. That's why it was the first group were all semiconductors. I mean, I had been at 2 semiconductor startups, companies that grew their own ingots and made their own final products under one roof. And so, I knew every aspect of the production. Not that I could do it, but that I understood it, that I could explain the products, and that, I could put it in I was a translator for the specs into the real world value of that product. And so as I said, I have lists, in my notebooks of the customers that I would call. On the first microprocessor, I can show you half a dozen or more, maybe 10 different early users with their phone numbers of the people I called, and then wrote stories on them.
Huh. When you say wrote stories, talk more about that aspect of your.
Well, it helps in several ways. There was again, and I'm sorry for not knowing his name, but he was an application engineer at Intel, and working with him and the whole idea was to get more examples of what products could use a microprocessor. You got to remember, the microprocessor, the 4004, came out in 1971, but it really wasn't until the 82, where IBM designed it into the PC, that they really hit a volume market. So up until that time, sales were growing, but very, very small. But it was in machine tools, and it was in things in medical instrumentation. It was in all sorts of different smaller companies or smaller market companies, and mostly my term is industrial type products. But still in all, we wanted a lot of that because that was what we could see ahead of us. And so this fellow and I sat down and said, how can we get more and more of the stories of these applications out there? And so I would call and interview the company, or go some of them I visited, the ones that were in the area. Atari was one of the early companies, and I went out to Atari and met with Bushnell and people like that back in the 70s. And I would write all the information down, and then we would write up a little sheet that would show the product, and then we describe what they're doing and how they applied the microprocessor, even with some circuitry if they would allow that. And then talk about the value of the product to them on the back. And then we put those in binders, and we had those binders all of Intel salesmen carried. And so we would just keep adding to that binder. So the 10 companies, there was that kind of a product identification and an example that was sent to them. Each month, or each week rather, we'd send out something new to them so they could take that out and show their customers what other people were doing with the microprocessor. Those stories also then made their way into application notes and into conversations with the analysts and media. So I could, rattle off a group of these applications.
And you could probably do that very quickly because you had the background knowledge of
right.
the industry, the technology, the customer base.
Right.
Yeah. much deeper than anyone else who was trying to compete with you at the time, I would guess?
I think I probably got a reputation of being a little bit aloof from the rest of the. I never joined any advertising or PR club or organization. I didn't attend any of their local or national conferences. But I was a member of the Semiconductor Industry Association. I was a member of the American Electronics Association. And so I decided the thing to do wasn't to join other people who were doing what I was doing, but to join my clients' organizations, because that's where I would learn more how to help them. And so I went to all the electronic and computer shows and technology and those sorts of things.
So the business you felt embedded in was your client's business, not the advertising.
Yeah, absolutely. If my client succeeded, I did. And so how can I help them, do better? And by doing that, I got to know everybody in the industry. I mean, I got to know, people at all of the other semiconductor companies and all of the other budding computer companies.
Let's start our our deep dive into Intel now. Let's start with at the very beginning, which is how you came to bring Intel into your group as a client.
Well, we actually, when I started, I made a list of 10 companies that I wanted to get as clients, and Intel was on that list. And again, largely because they had started when I was at National, but they had a reputation that preceded them that was greater than anything they were producing. They were producing some products, but again, they were bipolar. There was no hint of what would eventually become the RAM, the MOS RAM, and the microprocessor. One of the fellows who came to work with me was a guy named Don Coburn, and Don was sort of a special assistant to Bob Noyce at Fairchild, and did projects that Noyce wanted done, like try to do location work for plants and things like that. And then he went and did that same role with Charlie Spork. And after a while, I think Charlie felt he really didn't need that sort of person. And Charlie's one person that doesn't keep any extra employees around if he doesn't think he needs them. And so Don was, not doing anything. So I asked him to do some research for me, and research on a variety of things, and but also just figuring out what magazines we should be advertising in is sort of a research thing. And so Don was doing work for me on a part-time basis, and he got a call from Bob Noyce, and Bob wanted him to do a plant location work for them, for Intel. And Don said, "No, I'm too busy. I'm working for Regis McKenna right now." And Bob said, "Okay," and he hung up. So Don came and told me that. And I said, "Don, you go back and call him back. And you tell him that you will do it, and that you're going to ask in return that Noyce and I have a dinner. And I talk about what we're doing." And so Don called him back, said he would do the plant location work, and we set up a dinner with me and Bob. And and Don did do the plant location work. It ended up being the plant in Portland that they set up very soon after launching here, only a few years later, but probably mid-'70s maybe. And I had dinner with Bob and Ed Gelbeck, who was vice president of marketing.
Did you know Gelbeck at the time?
No, Gelbeck, though, was came from TI. He was vice president of sales, I think, there. And it was Don Valentine who recommended him to Noyce. So Ed and Valentine knew each other. And Ed was a little bit of a hippie guy. I mean, he was very bright and very personable. And so I made a presentation, and largely I think, I didn't know at the time, but I think probably, my working with people that they knew at both National and GME, the fact that GME had been promoting MOS technology, and I had done a lot of that, although it wasn't success. That wasn't something Noyce was necessarily looking for. Was a successful company. He was just looking for experience in doing that. And that is GME is where they hired Joel Karp, who was Les Fidesz hired him as the first MOS engineer at Intel. So I think he had that background, and I think that Bob knew that anybody who worked for Valentine and Spork was no slacker.
And not easily intimidated.
And so we had a very nice dinner, and I made a presentation to them, and then the next morning, Ed Gelbach called me and said, "We want to do it."
Just so it happened just that quickly.
Right, yeah. And so I was thrilled. And of course, you know that when you do that, it goes downhill immediately. I mean, a couple of the people that I didn't have people to put on it, and there were a few guys who were now freelancing out of Fairchild, because Fairchild had a large in-house group, and they wanted to do all the work because they knew Noyce and Moore and a lot of the people there, but they were horrible. They were once outside, they just. Fairchild people there, I think the noise level covered a lot of sins inside, and but they were really terrible, and they just about lost the business for me within weeks.
Oh. So this was Intel IPO'd in October of 1971. Was this before the IPO?
Yeah.
Okay. So they were not yet public.
Well, it was. I know we did the first annual report and the first quarterly report. And
what exactly did you pitch them on?
In handling all of their advertising, I took my a different approach to PR, which was much more personal and building relationships with the media and the analysts, overcoming the obstacles that they knew were there. Bob did not like to meet with the media. He would just as soon someone else do that. But he was very, very, very good at it.
I was going to say it's ironic because he was so good at it.
Yeah. But he was a very humble guy. I mean, he'd rather give the credit to everybody else, and sincerely he did. I mean, it wasn't a phony kind of aspect of his personality. He would do it if it was part of something that we felt had to be done or should be done. He would do it, but he was always uncomfortable at it. And it's one of the reasons there's so little actually published on him, and very few articles that he wrote, things like that. And he was such that we had writers now that could write articles, and approached him several times to have a ghostwriter, but he didn't want to use ghostwriters. He wanted to do it. He was always afraid, and he was fine at writing when he did, but he didn't want someone else to write stuff. He wanted to do it himself.
In your estimation, at that point in its early days as a company, what was it that Intel most needed in the way of marketing? What was it lacking that you could really help your business could lever
I think
up?
the ability to do it all. I mean, I think they were doing freelance people. They had different people. I don't think they had anybody specific doing it, either inside or outside. The product managers were kind of going off on their own and getting things done. And what did they need? I mean, I'll have to bring along maybe one of our illustrations will be the list of things I was doing, and just I would put down at the beginning of the week and in the 70s for Intel. It fills up a whole page. I mean, you would walk down the halls and people would just grab you and pull you in and say, I need this done, I need this done. And so you eventually become part of the team. And then I started bringing in, people. There's a fellow that used to work for me as an account executive. There's two of them. It was Bill Delaney and Jack Ramsey did a lot of work on Intel. And Jack Ramsey, who now is, lives in Portland. Every time and we stay in touch, he says he just still is so grateful. He said to think that I had an opportunity to actually work with people like Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore as a young kid. It just blew his mind that he could get in on these meetings and so forth as a very young person. So I brought people in very early, and I mean I was in the meetings too, but I brought in a lot of my people so they could learn and grow with clients. And it's not easy to transfer because they want you. If your name's on the door, they want you. Yeah. So, but we had lots and lots of teams of people working on Intel.
Were Noyce and Moore really hands-on with what you were doing? Were they close to that part of the business?
Not so much Gordon, but certainly Gordon would step in with information. We would interview him for technical details. Bob would have an opinion, but he didn't interfere with, Gelback was much more of the final word on stuff.
Uh-huh. And then how did that relationship evolve in the early years? Your relationship and the agency's relationship with Intel as you began to get more and more integrated into the company. Because what I think we want to get into is you personally and then your company became really integrated with Intel and its marketing efforts in a way that I think even today would be considered pretty rare.
Yeah, it was, say, with Apple. I mean, it was...
Exactly.
We were in on the development of the products very, very early. We sat in all their long-range product planning and so forth. And you did work as a... we were almost like a body shop. We were providing people to do things that were different than what they were doing, but were additive. And so I think that was a very, very unique relationship, no question about it. And they were clients for more than 20 years, yeah. And so was Apple. Apple also was more than 20 years, and eventually. Well, we can talk about that later, but it was such that you knew that it wasn't going to go that way forever, because as they got bigger and more complex, and people in different plants and different organizations wanted much more local control.
Sure. And how did it happen, though, that what was the sequence of events that led it to happen in the beginning, though? With Intel in particular.
You mean the teams?
The integration, yeah.
It was at Intel, things were focused around different groups of products. So there was memories, which eventually were, first of all, bipolar memories, and then the MOS memories, so that you had the 1103 was, I think, the largest selling RAM memory. And that became a whole sort of team of people working around memory. And then there was, shortly thereafter, Intel formed a memory systems group that were building cards and small boxes with lots of memory in them. So they would sell them as memory storage for selling to computer companies and larger mini computer companies and so forth. And that was also a struggle because these large arrays of semiconductor solid-state memories. I have, again, in my notebooks, I have several pages of discussion of what core memories were doing. So core memory was the type of memory that was used in these large computer and even medium-sized computers and other memory area where memory was used. And they were little ferrite cores that looked like little donuts. And they looked like a washer, that you might use on a bolt or a screw. But they were really small, a little bit thicker, and people literally strung them together in a matrix.
The matrix.
And and they could charge with the ones that they wanted and create a charged one, which was a 1 and a 0, and that created the readout of a memory. And you can still go on eBay and buy old ones for $50. You can buy one to just look at. They're kind of cool. So the structure of the memory that were created by Intel had to follow that matrix and had to follow the same sort of structure, information structure that core memory, because that was the basis. It was like the the wagon wheels becoming the roads for the railroad, right? They were so wide and so forth, and so the core memories became the basis for memory systems, and you had to convince memory companies or computer companies that semiconductor memory pricing in the long run was going to be much cheaper and much more prolific and larger size components than core. And what core kept doing was reducing the size and reducing the cost, but they could not get down to nanometers ever. So more again, the technology really put them out of business. But there was a crossover point, and that occurred in over the 70s and into the early 80s. And so it almost, it's like going back for me to the 1920s and seeing how things were done. They were pretty primitive, and I don't think most young people today that are in the business would know what I said if I said a core memory. That was a whole nother product area. And then there was the microprocessor, which was 10 years of application development. And then went through from 4-bit to 8-bit to 8/16-bit. And then new competition was arising. Particularly in Motorola and Texas Instruments both had microprocessors under development as it went along. So that whole process, plus the Crush program, which became one of the biggest marketing programs, pervasive marketing program, in the sense that it sort of fit the pattern of what I have later talked about is marketing is everything. And this was one in which every department of Intel was engaged, from the chairman of the board down to the operator. It required every product development to be centered around this, and to build alliances around aiding peripherals for the new processor family, to projecting the next products out in time. So it really set a pattern for that, and that was around the Crush program in late 79, early 80. And that led to getting the IBM business. And that again changed the fortunes of Intel forever, because once IBM put its muscle behind a PC, then we all know it darn near put Apple out of business.
Yep, and it meant everything to Intel.
Yeah.
It got to the point where you were you were brought into the product planning cycle, right? From a
Very early.
you
Very
would
early.
be brought in a year and a half
Yeah.
in advance of a product being launched. Talk a little bit about that and what that process was like.
Well, again, Intel was a lot like it was at National for me, and in GME. You met with the people who were doing the work at the bench, and you got an early education. We would go in a conference room, and they would give you, sort of the primer on whatever the product or the technology is, and why it's important, and all the various details of it. And again, I say in some of my notebooks, I go into extensive details on some of those meetings. And a significant product was the Intel development system, the Intellect, and that was it's a machine to help develop the program for the processor itself, that making a low-cost development system that allowed engineers to not have to write every piece of code, but to use this development system to write the code that they needed to program the processor with, sped up design time. And so, and there was a side issue here, was that Gordon Moore did not want to have, he was somewhat upset in the way we were going to talk about it, because it looked as if we were producing a computer, and Gordon didn't want Intel to compete with their customers. And so it was pulled back. I think on a Saturday morning, I got a call from Hank Smith, who was the product manager, and Hank said, "Can you come over?" And I said, "Yeah." So I went over to Intel, and he said, "I've never seen Gordon so mad in all my life." He got so far down down the introduction range that he didn't want us to look like we were challenging the next level of customer, because those are our customers.
Yeah. Was this an advertising campaign, or?
It was everything. It was sales, I mean, again, at Intel, there was no sort of one thing. It was a coordinated body of everybody doing of including everybody.
Yeah.
So there would be sales training, there would be individual conferences, there'd be seminar. Intel at one time gave more workshops and conferences than I used to say than the catalog out of De Anza's junior college. They really put on a lot of workshops and seminars on their products around the world, because it was a new technology, and people, when you think about it, these people who they were selling to were designing with these core memories. They were designing with discrete logic rather than programmed logic, and I have it again in my notebooks. I have Ed Gelbach had us make an ad, a phony ad, and it said, "Is Intel ready for software?" And that seems a little bit almost like, my God, you mean Intel? No, they didn't use software. These things were hardwired. And this was something that which you programmed it, you could change the program. So it had sort of a product that had infinite variety built into it, just through software. And that was a whole new concept at Intel. Yeah. And so think about it, the customers, they now had to stop being component pickers and now become programmers at the engineering at the bench. And that was an education. So pushing that education out was an enormous task around the world.
Yeah.
And so there was lots to do, lots to do. You ran. And then, I mean, there were people like Grove, who was always at the top pushing. And I mean, he was nothing could be done well enough or fast enough for Andy Grove.
How involved was Grove in what you were doing in your relationship, especially in the early days?
Not so much in the early days. It was really pretty much left up to Gelback.
Gelback.
And then in came Jack Karsten, who became vice president of marketing, and Jack came from TI. And Jack ran the MOS division at TI. So he came in. And Jack was a whole different personality. Do you know Jack at all?
I know Jack.
He wasn't anything like he is now. He has mellowed considerable.
That's saying something.
A lot. Yes. So imagine, 90% of the mellowness happening that he has in the last, 10 years. Jack was, but Jack and I got along really well. And, it's just adapting and learning how to work with people.
You gave this fascinating interview. I'm thumbing through these pages as you're talking in 1982 with Michael Ray, which I really loved. You can see I put about 40 tabs in it, and you talk about there's a question I want to ask you here, which is a little more philosophical, which is the concept of creativity, and I know you've thought and written a lot about that in your career. But I want to talk about the way that you described Intel as a creative company, and if you could talk about the personality of Intel as a creative company as you first encountered it, and how well that matched with what you felt you wanted to be building as a creative company in your own right.
Yeah. Again, when people say creativity, I think they think more of liberal arts and perhaps painting or writing poetry or literature or something of that nature. But I go back to my Professor Bolin that we talked about in the beginning, in which, he used to say that, you can have an IQ in a lot of different ways. You can have an IQ for writing. You can have an IQ for painting. You can have an IQ for chemistry. You can have an IQ. It's depending upon your talents and your inclination and your interests, you can develop interests around different areas, and I think that looking at Intel, I felt that the and I think a lot of this came from the top down, and I think a lot of it came from the founding fathers at Intel. It was the whole idea of always looking for a way to advance the technology, and not being satisfied with the performance level at any one plateau. And even when they had products that failed, as I mentioned, like bubble memory, they just kept moving on. And those products, they just, they certainly corrected their errors and moved. And the fortune's such that they kept hitting enough prize winners along the way that they were able to sustain losses in certain areas like watches, when they went into the liquid crystal watches, and we did those programs too. That the company just kept looking for better and better ways to do things, and it wasn't just in the products. Product marketing was such that they were always looking for better ways to educate the customer, educate the marketplace, to present the materials that around the product. The product marketing department was highly creative I thought at Intel. They liked to see new and different ways of presenting what they were doing to the public and to their customers. And so having the product marketing people, who in my mind have one foot in the market and one foot in engineering, And so they're the people that can actually see what the customers are asking for, and also can get engineering to tweak or to change or to put certain things into the next version of the product. And that was a skill. And I think Intel had its unusual good share of many of those people. John Doerr was a product manager. Another really wonderful guy was Jim Lally, who was also at Kleiner Perkins. And he was sort of the key driving force behind Crush. Dave House was a product manager to start with. So they were really, I think, people who came in with skills. Dave House, for example, came out of Honeywell. That was at a time when the technology was getting to the level of subsystems and systems. So we hear about VLSI and LSI and VLSI. Those are no longer just components. Those become really systems in themselves. And systems thinking then had to come in. Thus, sort of things like software and development systems, which Bill Davidow and others along their kinds of education out of the systems houses were able to bring into Intel and teach others about that, and to take that kind of approach. And they pushed a string for a while up a hill, and but eventually people sort of saw the necessity to do that, particularly as we got into the 80s in the personal computer world.
Yeah. And then how did that, you were involved in the very beginning in many of these projects, and then there was a point at which the handover really came to you and your group, and you were taking it out to the public. Can you talk about how that process worked and how you refined it in a way that made it so seamless?
Well, first of all, it wasn't. It was almost not a transfer, because we were a part of most of the teams
In the beginning, right.
At Intel.
Yeah. Yes.
And I mean, they always did that. I mean, you sat in these meetings that were doing the planning, and you were there probably every 3 or 4 days.
So when they brought you in the very beginning, this was essentially, that was the work relationship that you and Ed Gelbach established very quickly. As the way you
I
were
was
gonna
there
do
at least
business.
half a day every day, and then doing my work as well at on the rest of the companies. And when Apple came along, I used to say I'd spend a morning at Intel and an afternoon at Apple, and then whatever time was left over, I had to show up somewhere.
Yeah, for all the rest of the business.
Yeah. They were long days and nights. But you know what? It was exciting. I mean, it was one thing that you were aware of. These are, particularly with Intel and Apple, these are revolutionary products. There ain't been anything like this before, and there were only a few people that were saying that what was going to be possible, and the people who actually could foresee this and had a vision of this were more the technical people than the marketing people. The people like Noyce and people like Ted Hoff and Federico and people like that. Those were people who really did see what was possible with this kind of technology. I'll tell you a story. I met. And I'm going to forget his name, but there was a guy at TI who actually holds the patent on their microprocessor. God, I wrote his name down too so I could remember it. But
Was it Kilby?
No. This was an engineer down in the ranks.
Ah.
And so I later met him, and I think I got to know him at one of the conferences or so forth. He and I called him and had lunch with him, and I asked him, why didn't TI get their processor onto the marketplace. They had it very early, and so forth. And he's told me a story. He said, when I first developed the concept of the microprocessor, it was called a computer on a chip. And it was called, by the way, a microcomputer. It wasn't called a microprocessor. In those days, they termed it a microcomputer. And he said, I took it to my boss. And my boss, the idea and the concept and so forth, and my boss said, young man, don't you know computers are getting bigger, not smaller? And so that was, he said, the attitude was, there's no sense pursuing this because, computers are getting bigger. And so you need more memory, you need more whatever. And he had a whole new way of doing that. And so he had an uphill fight just getting the whole idea of the microprocessor sold. And the bureaucracies of TI, the bureaucracies of Motorola, and I had conversations with the guy, the division manager at Motorola as well. I got to know, and he had similar experiences with corporate, trying to get any kind of approval on budgets and so forth to get them out into the marketplace. And in fact, at one point, Spindler wrote him a personal letter, which Spindler gave me a copy of, saying you have to hire Regis McKenna to help you figure out how to get Motorola more into the public's eye, and they never followed up on it.
This was unique, wasn't it, in another way, in that you were having to take a very technical, very arcane thing like a microprocessor and turn it into something a consumer should know about, should be aware of, should understand was coming at them. First of all, why was that important to anyone? And second, how did you go about formulating a whole strategy for putting it out there in a way that the average person could understand?
Well, for one thing, I had very good people, very good writers, and they were putting stuff out there in magazines, and that helped tremendously. A lot of our early writers were journalists or ex-journalists, and they were probably the best translators in trying to put it out there for easy consumption. The evolution was that the trade magazines became more news oriented, and the business press became more technically oriented. And those were two. The two were moving together. They were moving together, and you could just see it by calling on them. And I well recall meeting into, I don't know, it was probably well into the 80s, but a new editor at Business Week, and he no longer wanted to know about products. He wanted to know about the people, and he just quizzed me up and down about the people at Intel, the people at Apple. What were they like? Where did they live? What do they do on vacations? What are these? So it started becoming People magazine. And there was this whole changeover that this is becoming more interesting as a phenomena in our society rather than just the technical aspects of it. And most of the technical companies hated that. But the cult of personality. Yes. Yeah. Because they wanted their people to remain in the background, right? Well, they wanted not only the people, but they didn't want to talk about their personal lives. They wanted to talk about, the benefits of the product. They were in business to sell products and make money. I've got this. This is a little ahead of the period we're talking about, but this is the page out of Business Week, 1980, where it's Moore and Noyce and Andy Grove, yes, all
posed on top of what is clearly a kind of a ruby lith of a
Right.
microprocessor.
Yeah, that was,
It's called triumphant triumvirate. Noyce, Moore, and Grove have guided Intel from obscurity to number 4. That was even before they were
yeah.
the top company.
That was the 486, that Mylar. The 486 was a product that was developed up in Portland plant, and it was a super new product that they spent a lot of money on to develop. It was really a complete system on a chip, and it was developed, and the core to it was object-oriented code, which was a different way of sort of packaging bits of code into sort of its own little modules and plug and playing those. And so it was a whole new architecture, and they worked years on it, and had to actually kill the project after spending a lot of money. Grove told me later that what they learned from that, though, was how to build the process equipment for the next generation, because that particular product was required a lot more complex testing and testers, and so that is just doing that, he felt, was worth the investment.
So that I wanted to hold up that ad because it's very much on point with what you were talking about. Somehow between the early to mid 70s and that Business Week article in 1980, which is a very short amount of time, business coverage of the industry moved, didn't it? It wasn't just the technology, it was the people who were...
Yeah, but it was also the people at the magazine. Lou Young was editor of Electronics Magazine. Lou Young became editor of Business Week. Bob Henkel, who was a key technology writer and editor, I think he was at the Wall Street Journal, and then he was at various newspapers. He was a real newsman, but he covered technology most of his life, and he went from Electronics, where he was the managing editor, to Business Week. People like Forbes and others started hiring more technically oriented people, and people on their staffs started becoming interested and started focusing on it part-time. The Wall Street Journal had a guy named Dick Schaefer. He was out of Boston. He was a general purpose writer, but he would write columns on the technology business from time to time, and sort of got stuck with it and ran with it, and he built his own career around it. And so these are people who had moved into these positions because they were, and then they would cover it not full time but just part time. There were some people like at Fortune, there was a guy named Gene Belinsky, and Gene was very technically astute. He wrote very in-depth articles on technology businesses, science, and he started writing some of the early articles on Intel and on Moore and Noyce. And in fact, he did a major. Fortune used to run these real in-depth, multi-page articles, and he did one on Noyce and Moore as the sort of the two-headed, instead of the triumvirate, it was the two-headed geniuses that created the new technologies of the future. And I can tell you a little side story if you want me to say that, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, let's do that.
I got a call from Bob Noyce one day, and he wanted to meet with me for lunch, and so we met near Intel. There was a place, and we met. And, he told me that Andy Grove came in and threw that Fortune article on his desk and said, "I quit." And Bob was sort of flabbergasted. Says, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you and Gordon get all the attention." and I'd get nothing. And I don't know what the rest of the conversation was about, but I guess Bob calmed him down. And so then Bob said to me, we got to do something for Andy. We got to get him more attention. And so I said, okay, I'll work on it. And I went, it turns out I got a call from a fellow from the New York Times. And I forget his name now, but he was one of the original science editors for the New York Times. And he wanted to do a story on Noyce. And I convinced him to do it on Andy. And I told him in Andy's background, coming from Hungary, not being able to speak English, but going to school in New York and doing all those sorts of things. And he said, gee, that makes a really good story. And I said, and besides, Andy's sort of the production guy behind all of this stuff. And so probably a few weeks later, he comes out, he meets with Andy, and they do a Sunday New York Times, probably 3 full New York Times pages on Andy. And they call it the King of Jelly Beans, I think it was. And, he could produce these things. He was the guy that really made it happen. And from then on, I became Andy's good friend. and Andy got a taste of fame, and never left it behind.
And all was well.
Yeah, all was well, and he continued to pursue it. So much so that I know at one point I gave him a list of key journalists and analysts, and that I would always call on in New York over the years, and I said, they don't want to talk to me, they want to talk to you, so you go call on them. And I gave him the contact information, and he did. That's every time he went to New York, he'd meet 1 or 2 of them and 3 of them.
And how was he in those situations?
Oh, he was very good. He liked to teach. He taught courses at Intel. He, for all new employees, he would always give an orientation, and he took it very seriously. He wrote he wrote a couple technical books. So he loved teaching. So he was pretty good. He could be very smooth and sweet at times, and very rough at other times.
Did you find that he had a good mind for marketing, the way that you were, when you think about your vision for the way that Intel was becoming a very visible company, not just an important technology company, but really synonymous with the whole rise of personal technology in particular, and the way that it needed to be marketed. Did you find that Andy was on board with all of that?
I don't necessarily think that Andy had that sense, but I think he developed it over time. And I think he was much more observant than even I thought he was at the time. He was strongly opinionated, but he let things ride too. If he didn't like something that we were doing, he would tell me about it. Definitely tell me about it. And he told me, for example, when there was a series of ads in which we hired Pat Nagel, who was an illustrator for Playboy, and he did these very modernistic illustrations, and the engineers didn't like them, and as he said, and so we met in a parking lot at Intel, and he said, I sometimes think it would be cheaper to fire you. And I said, what's that all about? He said, the engineers waste so much time arguing over your ads that I could save a lot of the time and in their productivity, increased productivity just by firing you. And so then he went and got in his car. I mean, so he didn't necessarily do those kind of things, but he would pass on information like that. he, but I even went on vacation with him and his wife to the Alps one time, traveling Europe and visiting Intel plants. Andy was just a very, very direct, and I really think at times he could have been much more mellow, and he lost a lot of good people at Intel because he confronted them so harshly in front of everybody else, and that I think he had this theory of confrontation, and then later on he said constructive confrontation. He changed the word, but so he would try to learn, and I think it was just coming out of that very strict engineering background, as well as sort of a rigid way of looking at the world from his childhood and upbringing. But he could be a sweetheart too.
It's frequently said that Noyce and Moore needed Andy to make the whole thing work. Was that, would you share that view?
Well, I think they debated that. I should say, and I don't know, this sounds a little self-serving, but at one of the last Intel reunion that was here at the museum, Andy, when I arrived, and he came up to me and he put his arms around me and he said, "My teacher." So, and I knew what he meant, and it was that he had learned stuff over the years. And
well, talk more about that. How he was knowing, having learned your style and having learned a little bit about Andy's style. I would say you both are lifelong learners. You both just have these very active minds, and you're always trying to learn more. And what was it like to work with Andy, and what did you feel he needed to know that you needed to help impart to him?
Well, I think, again, we can get into it later, but the Crush program was one of the places in which I had a real opportunity to have. He was in all the meetings, and he picked me to be on the Crush team. There were, I think, 8 or 9 people that were on that team, and it was all inside, Intel people, except I was the only outside person. So he that just selection said, I appreciate what you're doing, and I think it's important to what we're doing. And so, and you could contribute in any way. He just wanted you to contribute. So, and from my philosophy being that the ad's the last thing you do, the whole idea of what are all of the parts of the Crush program that are essential to pull together. And there were other creative people, David Al had a lot of ideas on ads, and I would be quiet, I'd let them do that. I mean, because I didn't think that I had a monopoly on creativity, so everybody's ideas could be included in whatever we did as well. So I think that, and that program was the most extensive and far-reaching at Intel, to say that if you're going to position a company as a leader, then everybody in the company has to take that position, and it's not relegated to marketing.
Yes.
I started fairly early because the quality movement in the world, and particularly in the start in the semiconductor industry, the Theory Z, the Japanese Z, Theory Z, style of management, all of the quality circles and all that sort of thing it started. And I sort of felt that was marketing, that marketing was like that. It shouldn't be looked at as a function. It should be looked at as we do quality. And quality is something that the whole organization has to take responsibility for. So, every aspect of the company, how you greet people when they come, how the salespeople present, relevant and vital information, how they learn about the customer before they knock on their door, Every little thing becomes part of it when people saying that's a quality organization. And I think that you don't call it such, but that quality program was a marketing program. And people would say that takes it down a notch, but I didn't think so. I think that's what moves the product. And, the pride of an Apple employee is something that really extends well beyond that company in terms of marketing. Their logistics is part of their quality and part of their marketing program. So it all adds up. And I think when you're in a meeting and you're talking about sales and you're talking about distribution and you're talking about building partnerships, when you're talking about, and I mean real partnerships. So, for example, one of the things they needed was some peripheral devices that Intel didn't have or wouldn't have for some time, that they needed to create a full populated board for performing certain kinds of computer applications. And so I believe I talked to Dave House and Jack Karsten, and I knew Jerry Sanders over at AMD pretty well. I called him and got them to have lunch together. Andy got really pissed off over that, but I think they did indeed do a relationship. And so, but that was well outside of what I'm sure Andy thought I should do. But I knew Jerry well enough to have a conversation with him like that when no one else felt comfortable that way. And they certainly didn't want, Andy wouldn't have done it. And how did that all happen? Because when I had a lot of my evening dinners program, that's called Evening With programs, when I invited in Mrs. Graham from the Washington Post and her staff, and I invited in people from the New York Times and all of the top papers and magazines, I would invite them to come to dinner, one at a time, one magazine or group at a time. And I would invite not only my clients, but people like Jerry Sanders who wasn't a client. And I'd invite but the presidents of most of the companies that I knew in the Valley that were interested in whatever subject we were talking about. And so I had been doing that every with Jerry, and so we got to be sort of good friends. And and Valentine introduced me to him when I started at National. So, you have these relationships that you build over time, and they do pay off.
So we were talking before the break about Andy Grove in particular as an executive and working with him and his relationship to Moore and Noyce. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. There's different views. I always say when you talk about people like Andy Grove or Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or whatever, there's it's like the blind man touching the elephant. Everybody has a different description or idea of what they're actually touching. And so there are certainly people who work closer to Andy, who work directly in Intel, but I had a lot of contact with him for 20 years there. And and we got along really well. We disagreed on a lot of stuff, and that never seemed to bother him in the sense that he didn't hold a grudge against you. But he could make it really difficult because Andy once said his goal his objective is to sort of present so many obstacles in the way of ideas that if they get through those obstacles, then it's probably worth doing. And so he would do that with products. He would do that. So he was always sort of the one that raised his hand and said stuff at the product meetings, at the planning meetings, and so forth. And as I said, I saw him in Germany, really berate the head of the German Intel's operations there in front of his employees, and I was just I was stunned by that. I mean, I felt that was just out of order. Something you would do personally and privately, but not in front of the employees of a person. And that was early on. That was probably in the late 70s, and I think his relationship to Noyce, and I don't know what happened at Fairchild. I don't know what transpired there, but Noyce was very successful in his own right, and he didn't try to be. And I think Andy worked very, very hard to achieve what he achieved, and certainly he did more, I'm sure, than he ever expected in his life. But Noyce, it just all came easy to. He was, he was a champion skier. He was a champion. He flew, his own jet. He was a great swimmer and diver. He was in demand at high intellectual circles of technology. I went with Bob to Switzerland to one of the institutes of technology there, to where he got an award, and Noyce was seen around the world as somebody really unique and special, and I'm sure it was from his original being part of the Shockley team, and then it also enhanced when he was picked as the leader to start Fairchild. I think from a communication standpoint, people saw him as sort of the leader, although it was really sort of a consensus, I think. And then the formation of Intel. As I said, even before they did anything, there was a belief that something was going to come out of that was really great, because of the people that they took with them. And so I think there was a sort of a comparison that Andy often made, and he felt that a lot of the things Bob did were not adding to the output of product and productivity at Intel, and so he I would say he didn't like Bob very much, and would often complain about him. I know he even complained to me about him once, and there was a debate going on between memory products and the microprocessor group, and the memory products were under steep decline because of the competitiveness of Japan, and the memory people didn't know where they were headed, what was there, and there was so much money being pushed into microprocessors at that time from the company standpoint. So people were a bit confused, and I remember walking with Andy and saying, the noise is getting pretty loud out of the memory group, and people are trying to determine what their future is. And I said, you ought to get together. And I said that you ought to get together with Andy and Bob and decide what to do to keep people happy. And he sort of, said to me, ask Andy and Bob. He says, I don't even know where they are. I can never find them. And he said it really harshly to me. And again, this was supposed to be the triumvirate running the company, so with Bob, he just had it seemed to bother him a lot that Bob wasn't on the production line making things. Then when Bob stepped down as president, he gave him a cubicle in another building, and sort of pushed him aside, and there were a lot of different things that occurred that I think he didn't think that Bob was a real contributor, And I don't know whether this was just sort of, sort of elitism on some of the part of some of the engineers. There was, in that group that originally formed Fairchild, there were a lot of really different personalities, and as John Kennedy said, success has many fathers, and I think that from the beginning of Fairchild and all of the activity that occurred, I think that there's a lot of go back and rewrite history or re-perceive what history was and who contributed what. And so some people felt that Noyce didn't deserve to have the patent on the planar process, while others, they felt it was really someone else in the group that was much more involved in pulling that off. So, whereas I'm sure it was really a team approach in the end, and Bob wasn't the kind of person that would take credit for something he didn't do, but Bob was really sought after, and Andy wasn't sought after for his opinion until much later, and I think he earned what he got, what he reaped later on. He did write his books. He did, Intel grew really strong and fast under him. Intel, and I really don't have any negative thoughts about Andy, although Andy, when he became president, his one of his goals was to replace a lot of the stuff that we did with internal people, and I think it was because of control. We were in every operation of Intel, from Europe to Portland to we really had teams working all over the world on them, with them, and on every part of the company, and he I think I was told by someone internally that Andy really wanted to lessen the amount of people from my company that were involved in Intel, that we weren't employees, and I think Andy felt more secure having people that he could control internally, and that's the way I read it anyway. And so I knew for maybe it took 3 to 4 years for them to actually do that. That's how entrenched we were.
That was a lot to unwind.
Yeah, and it took at least 3 different people that were replaced that were supposed to do it. And it's just that we were very close to the teams in there, and so it really got to a point where I said to Andy, I'm going to resign you because I can get another client that is on the growth path, and you're on the decline path. And so he didn't seem to bother him at all that we were going to leave the team, which also surprised me. But later on, as I told you, he was very friendly to me and very nice.
Yes.
So I think he mellowed.
If you think about it from Noyce's perspective, looking back, looking at through Noyce's eyes at those relationships, especially with Andy, how would you describe it? What would you say that was in return if Andy felt?
Bob never said a negative thing about anybody. I am absolutely positive of that. I worked with Bob when he moved to Austin because I was very involved with the Semiconductor Industry Association and helping them. I even gave a testimony before Congress for the SIA. I wrote articles on the competitive nature of the technology, U.S. technology versus Japan, and the trade tariffs and literally exclusions in not some markets was happening to U.S. semiconductors. So, I worked closely with him on a lot of stuff, and he never once said anything negative about Andy, ever. He was a team player, and it was just a gentleman. I mean, so Andy was more volatile. He was, and that could just be so was Steve Jobs, right? I mean, Steve was volatile, and so what I like to say is that at one point I had Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Andy Grove as clients all at the same time, and so it wasn't a surprise to me when somebody was volatile at all times.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
We agreed we're going to talk a little bit about a specific project, so you could walk us through end to end. But before we do that, I had a question in my notes that you and I have talked about, which is what you observed when Intel really went through its major crisis as a company and hit the wall financially, and it wasn't clear what the future was going to be for Intel at all. And that's an really interesting story. It gets lost in history, I think, because Intel is seen as this machine that just continually rolls forward, and yet it had a major stumble, and you witnessed a lot of that firsthand at the time. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, this was the point at which I had mentioned to Andy about the memory group being lost as to what their future role was going to be,
because memories were winding down and the next product hadn't emerged.
They were they were winding down largely because they were losing business, and that came out of a quality movement that companies like Hewlett-Packard said that the Japanese memories were much more reliable, and according to their measurements, and then the U.S. semiconductor memories and Intel. And so the memory business was on the decline, and that was Intel's bread and butter. That was their staple for a number of years, and the processor had yet to really find a mass market. There were, I could give you specific numbers on it, in terms of revenue, but they were quite small. They were in, I think the most that I have in my notebooks in those days was something like 20 million, 25, 30 million, something like that. And I think one year they went to like 78 million. But those are relatively small numbers to sustain a company's R&D and production activity that Intel was already at. And so when the microprocessor was out there, and all companies, and so there were two other companies. Obviously, there was Motorola, who had the 6800, and then it became the 68,000, and they got out with the 68,000, or had announced that they were going to release the 68,000, which was largely a 16-bit architecture-built product. And TI was in the offing, and there were probably one or two others that were fooling around with microprocessors. There was a salesman in Boston who kept running into customers who were designing in the Motorola processor into their future systems. And he wrote a memo to Andy saying that he kept noticing this in a variety of places, and it was pretty concerned about it, and that Intel had not really kept up with the state of the art in processor development. And I can't think of his name right now, but he became a sort of almost a legend at Intel, where Andy read it, and once the salespeople were saying, we're having a tough time getting design wins, he sat up and took notice. So Andy called together people from different divisions and in the microprocessor group and marketing group, and I'm not sure who it all was, but there was sort of a room full of people in Santa Clara, and he decided to get a task force together to really find out what the issue was and how we would address it. And there was about, I'm going to say 8 or 9, maybe 10 people that were on that group, and Andy selected me. I was a little bit surprised. I was in the meeting. I wasn't surprised that I was always in the meetings, but it was surprised that he said, "Hey, you want you to be part of that." And so we went to one of the hotels here in the area. I think it was Ricky's Hotel or somewhere, and basically met every day for 3 days, and literally figured out what the competition was by looking at strengths and weaknesses of Intel, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of Motorola, looking at comparison of sales organization, what salesmen were saying around the country, Intel salesmen, looking at design wins, and because the product marketing people had pretty good handle on what design wins were pending and what was in the offing but wasn't happening. So there was a really knocked down 3 days chalkboard conversation that went on, and it was led by people like Bill Davidow and Dave House and Jim Lally. I think was very prominent in it. But the other people, there was some of the design engineers are in there too, who had things to say and what technical pieces were missing, what software might have been missing, and so forth. And so you ended up with this complete picture that there was a lot more required than simply going out and selling harder. There was a lot more than going out and reducing prices or providing incentives for design. And so we came back and we made a report to the executive staff, Andy ran those meetings. He used to keep a clock beside him, and so you had so much time to do your presentation, and when that alarm went off, you're done. I gave a presentation on what I thought, what we could do, and what, quite frankly, the media becomes a reflection of you in those kinds of things, because I was getting a lot of feedback from the journalists who were talking to Motorola, who were talking to TI, who were talking to other companies, and they talked to users. So.
And what were the journalists saying to you?
Well, they were saying that Intel's losing its position in the marketplace, and that that they saw Motorola, and they had no reason to favor one or the other. They saw Motorola dominating, or at least about to take the dominant position in microprocessors, and they knew there were other developments coming, so they just saw more competition, which didn't seem to have come about. Now we're talking 79, so the first microprocessor at Intel was in 71, and I think there was a lot of hesitancy over those years as to how hard and fast to push that technology as well. So you sort of present your own picture and objectives, and then with Andy, you always had to present a series of goals and objectives, and what you could go about and do. And we would move more and more aggressively to talk about the value of our new products and how to become more of a systems presentation. And so we went away and did this, and one of the conversations that came out of this, which was, I think, a really fundamental and key decision among the Crush group, is to not sell the engineer, but sell top management. In other words, the engineer is going to be protective of whatever designs he has. If he's not switching to the microprocessor, and I had friends in engineering and around the Bay Area, and I talked to them, and a lot of them thought the microprocessor was just a phony excuse to sell memory, that it really wasn't a valuable product in itself, and they had to have adopted microprogramming and software, learn how to do that, and that was not an easy task for them. So they didn't readily want to change to something new, and they've spent time already designing it one way. And so talking to top management, you could talk about productivity, about getting your products to market faster, about the economics of getting your product to market faster, and with much more flexibility in terms of how you could add in more functionality and how you could change it, and without having to redesign the whole product again. You could change it with software. So there was a lot of benefits to using the microprocessor. And they had it right down to I have this in my notebook, the cost of the circuit card, the cost of the devices, the cost of production of them, and down to the cents, and then the cost of doing it from microprogramming in the microprocessor. So one device, you could replace a bucket full of components, and certainly shorten the time to market substantially. And then the other thing we did was we started writing articles. David Al wrote some articles, and Dave House, and I've got and certainly presenting to the journalists this whole argument around the business, and then changing who you talk to. So more and more talking to people at Fortune, Business Week, Economist, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, even that, where the business people would start reading it rather than just, so it was that move out of the trade into the business press. And that was a significant change, because most people felt that all they had to do was write a technical article and show people how to design with it. That no longer sold, but what did sell was the economic argument, the benefits to your corporation, and how it could become more profitable by using processors as the fundamental components in your design of your instrumentation or your computer. And so when we came back with that presentation, then we presented it, they bought it right into it, approved it right there on the spot, approved a substantial budget. And the budget included incentives for salesmen, increasing incentives for design wins. It focused the design wins on specific kinds of customers we looked at. And I think I have these charts too, which is telecommunications, who are the top telecommunications companies, who are the top computer companies, and we did it by industry segment, and then put together a war room at Intel, which was literally a war room, with pins and maps and things like that, and made individual presentations for every type of industry. So if you were going to make a call in the telecommunications industry, there was a box that had all of the information and all of the slides and all of the presentation materials that you would need to make that to a telecommunications company. If it was to an instrumentation company, you had all that. If it was to a computer company, it was all, and these boxes were made up. They were large boxes. And it was all the detailed slides, overheads, primarily, and things like that. So it was an extensive program, and you reset your goals and objectives every week on Wednesday, and you came in and on that Wednesday, and you gave a presentation on your successes and failures, and you did tell what your successes and failures were, because if you try to fudge anything, you were caught immediately. And nobody did it anyway. I think this was looked at as a very serious thing to do. But everybody was a high degree of energy, and people literally were working around the clock to make this happen. And it was the output of that knowledge. There was a presentation, I think it was to Olivetti, and that was refined to make the presentation to IBM. And now there are some other things that some people will claim that they did that got IBM on board, but I think if it weren't for the Crush program, I don't think it would have happened. And it was one part of the presentation was that we showed the 4004, 8008, 8080, 8086, and question mark next 8080 product. And it was a linear line, and it had time down here, and complexity, and it was that you could, if you got on the architecture of the 8080, the 8086 architecture, you could upgrade your end product, eventually your personal computer, without having to redesign everything and rewrite software. And so, and this apparently, Motorola didn't buy into. So we literally, first time ever, Intel started talking about future products.
And a roadmap.
And a roadmap of where we're going. And we had to do that for certain users so they could feel comfortable committing. And it was that commitment that changed the history of Intel, made them profitable. Now, IBM put an investment in Intel at the same time when they committed to it. They actually put some people into Intel to help, I think, ramp up production. IBM wanted to have a complete fab dedicated to their product. I think Intel talked them out of that. There was debates over how much Intel or IBM wanted to buy of Intel, what percentage. And that got tenuous at times because I had a feeling that later on Noyce was more concerned about giving away control of the company.
Did IBM want control at some point? Did it want enough to actually
I
take
think
over
that was
Intel?
on their side they were debating, because I think that at some percentage they'd have to start reporting their financials on Intel, and I think that's it. I don't know what the percentage is, whether it's over 45 or 50%. So in effect, they ended up with a lot of commitments on production, and they did take I think about 20% of Intel in the end. I'm not sure that was a total number, but it was substantial and enough cash to actually get them back on the. They were almost out of cash, so that really filled their coffers. So it was a tenuous period for the management, and Andy was driving, and Andy, of course, being in control of the whole company. So what the Crush people said they needed, Andy was able to see that everybody complied across the company. So there was enough power there to say that we're all in this together. And I think it really did save Intel. And it brought them to a whole new level of systems business, because one of the things I remember, Dave House was very adamant in trying to start looking at these things as systems rather than as discrete chips. And we even did a renumbering of the products and around sort of classes of systems and that sort of thing. And that was Dave House that did that. So everybody contributed in some way or another, and everybody went on the road, and everybody went on these analyst and media tours. Everybody in that group to deal with. So people like Dave House and Bill Davidell and them became much more active in actually going on the road and doing more quote marketing of it and of the new approach that Intel was taking.
You had been talking to journalists who were quite aware of Intel's problems. How did this affect them? How did this affect the journalist viewpoint of Intel?
Well, I think there was always, and sometimes they were accused that the media was a little bit biased towards Intel. And again, I think that was because of the founders. Yeah. And so there was, I think they wanted to believe that Intel was going to be all right. And of course, they were interested in anything that was new or that was going to change the sort of the hierarchy of the market, in the market. And they accepted it really, really well. But I don't think it wasn't sort of a, hey, wow, this is great. It was, okay, let's see what you're doing, And yeah, we're interested in covering it as closely as we can. We sort of sublimated the word crush because the lawyers at Intel felt that might be an obstacle and from our competitors, but Intel wasn't that dominant at the time, and so it was just a major push to get the. Well, they first came out with a 16-bit 8086, and then the real, like the Pentium and that came years later, but it was an evolutionary process from 4004 up to the 8080 and then through the 8086 and then beyond that.
Do you remember, apart from the IBM element of this, the moment when it became clear that all this had really worked and that this next phase of Intel was really on its way?
I don't think it was clear right then, because I think that they still had a lot to do in terms of development of the technology. And so I think internally they were running 100 miles an hour to get all of this done. And again, it was long hours, a lot of work, and a lot of demands for meeting your goals and objectives, and that was true up and down the line. So people really were hustling for about 5 years, because even though you got, IBM committed to the processor and to the technology and to the evolution of it going forward, they still had to build something, and you had to plug parts into it when it was ready, and that was that still took some work.
All right, so we're now at the end of the decade of the 70s. We're going to get into Apple in the next session, but let's talk about the status of your company now and at the end of its first decade, from 70 to 79. Where are you as a company? Who are your big clients other than the big two we've talked about, and how do you feel things are going?
Well, for me, we had our biggest challenge was trying to find people, and for me it was being spread really thin, because there was we started having people saying we do the same thing, and I didn't see any great challenges, but I think that as long as there's an ego out there, people were going to hire PR firms. And most of these people who are entrepreneurs have an ego, and whether you can convince them that it's not the way to do or not, they still want it. There was a period in which a number of companies in this area, sizable companies, were doing television ads. And it always baffled me as to why they were doing television ads. Sun. It had a dozen users. They were mainly building at that time. They were selling into the internet developers, so the reason they did it, I'm sure, was simply because somebody did it, and then they thought, gee, that's a good idea, and we'll do it too. One of the excuses was we're trying to reach Wall Street, but Wall Street knew what you were doing because they had analysts covering all these areas, and we're getting detailed reports. So it was much more on performance at the financial level than it was about your image out there. So I felt that they still liked the media. They still liked to get their picture in the paper.
Right.
And but from a standpoint of the 80s and the clients, the client in the 70s we had was Spectrophysics, and they were booming. Spectrophysics, was the laser company, and they did a low-level laser, and they did the first, I think it was about $100 laser. So that was then going into many of the scanning devices. And so they were growing very, very rapidly, and they were a long-term client. In the 70s also, we had Boschert. Boschert was the largest supplier of modems in the country. They were number one supplier out of Georgia. And Bob Boschert had founded this company. And they were a very large client of ours. We had Magnuson. Magnuson was they were trying to enhance the performance of mainframe computers and mini computers by building add-on processing modules and so forth. And Carlton Amdahl was the founder of that, and Carlton was the son of Gene Amdahl. So I had a chance to have dinner with both Carlton and Gene Amdahl back in the 70s. And which was just great. I mean, when I had dinner with Gene, we talked and so forth and so forth. And I asked him, does he use a personal computer? And I remember Carlton kind of laughing and saying, "Dad, show him what you do." And he had just flown in on an airplane and came to dinner with us. And he opened up his notebook, and it was a bigger notebook, and it all across 2 pages was nothing but equations. And he said he just does it out of his head. He just writes these equations, and then you'd see scratch out, and then you do it. And so both pages, and they were, all these figures and numbers and brackets and so forth, various algorithms, I guess, of some sort or other looked like them. And I said, man, that looks like a Picasso. It was so jammed. So the next day, well, not the next day, but I think he did it the next day. A couple days later, I get a mailing from Gene Amdahl, and he took a copy of the page and signed it, and he wrote a little note saying, "Here's your Picasso." And so I that's in my collection up at Stanford. But it was really kind of cool to get to know him back then. Vidar was a telecommunications company, network company. Byte was the first computers retail store.
Yep.
Down
The
in
Byte
Mountain View.
shops, yeah.
Byte shops. When they started, we were them. Genentech started about the same time Apple did, about 76, 77. And just like Apple, it was the first two founders I started with, Bob Swanson and Herb Boyer, and helped them actually pull together the original marketing plan, or business plan, actually.
We're going to do a whole session on
Okay,
Genentech.
and then across the bay was a company called Cetus. Cetus did similar things. They were a biotech company working with manipulating cellular structures and eventually DNA. There was Aston Martin, yes, the 007 car. That company was bought by Peter Sprague, the former chairman of National, and he asked me if we would help market that car. He didn't have to market it. Went out and talked to the dealers, and they said people just call up and say, "Send me the most expensive car you have." So it was not. They never marketed it. And 007 sold everything. And there was Siliconics. Another really significant company was Measurex. Mesorex was founded by a guy named Dave Bosson, and Mesorex made some of the first digital processing equipment for process industries like making paper, lumber processing, and large mills. And so in the paper processing, to me it was as fascinating as the microprocessor or semiconductors. When you go into a paper, it's made of a slurry of just liquid, but how much liquid, how much pulp you put in, and keeping that under control during the process can enhance your profitability. And so no matter what you're doing, whether you're cutting lumber or you're doing any kind of these big bulk processing, the machines, the digital machines, were able to give you the precise amounts and measurements and thickness that enabled you to actually make money but keep it high quality. And that was Mesorex was doing that down in Cupertino. And that was a fun company because I got to visit all these mills. And when you stand beside a paper rolling mill where they're making these huge rollers of paper going 1,000 miles an hour around these things, and you're standing next to it, it's scary. It is it's an incredible process. And and they had to adapt. They did things where people who worked these factories weren't digital engineers, and they had digital machines sitting there. And I think the behind it was a digital equipment's early fax products that ran it all, and they built the sensors and so forth. But the buttons were big red buttons that would say stop, go, and so they did. So with gloves, they could just hit them like this rather than tiny buttons like a computer. So they did everything they could to design their product fit for the paper mill or the lumber mill. And they were later bought by some big production company in the country. And I think there's an oral history of Dave Bosson here, too.
There is. Yeah, that's right. So at the end of the 70s, how many people did you have?
Well over 100, probably 150 people.
And total revenues were what?
Going to the 70s. Well, again, you have to include advertising and the what I call market relations part of it, and that would have been 30 million. Half of it being advertising. But advertising, you counted then the days of the total ads, and then you took a commission from it.
Right.
But I sold that in 81. So, but in the late 79, then we were probably doing around 30 million.
You sold that business to Chiat, right?
I sold the advertising business to Chiat Day.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that's brief, but another story is that Jay was my ad agency when I was at National. And I got to know him really well. Very highly creative guy, highly creative shop. They really were, they broke the rules of advertising. They were somewhat arrogant, but the people at National loved them, and Valentine loved them. Jay was just a really interesting guy. So even Valentine used to, when I'd say I'm going down the agency, he would go with me, just to meet the people and spend time there. And because he was in L.A., he had access to so many different writing talents and other skills. And of course, he did the 1984 ad for Apple. And I didn't like either, quite frankly, the advertising or the PR side of it, and thought I wanted to move out of that to something with a higher value. Advertising is really hard because in the engineering community, to sell anything, to sell any ad, many times you had to sell it to the wives of the people who were buying it. And somebody's wife was always an English major, so therefore she was equipped to judge what you were doing. it really had many critics constantly. And so it's not easy to sell into a technical world that was used to, specsmanship and create anything of value beyond it. And all of our clients, we did original art for MeasureX. I hired Jean Fallon, he's in the Modern Museum of Art. He's then in those days, and he was a illustrator, and you'd recognize his work. It's really out there and very futuristic. And he did the spectrophysics ads out of Paris, and so we reached out, but that was all sort of influenced by Jay Scheid. And I would take ads down and show them to Jay, and he would critique them, and so we stayed friends even when I started business. And I used to meet him from time to time, and I told him I wanted to get out of the ad business, and I don't think he took me seriously until one day I met him in the LA airport. I was heading up here, and he was heading back, and we stopped, and he said to me, "Are you serious about wanting to get rid of the ad business?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well," and he got the Fairchild business. And one of the reasons he gave up the national business was because Fairchild was 3 times the size of national. And he said, "Well, we're going to make a presentation this week to Fairchild. And if they don't buy it, we're going to resign them." And I said, "Okay." And so I got a call from that afternoon, and when I got back to the office, and he said, "I know what I said, but even if they do accept it, we're going to resign them." They just had a tough time with, again, the engineering or whatever. Whereas, I think I was going to give them Intel and Apple, And
you had a client base that was big and prestigious.
Yeah, and we had already
understood it.
And we had already put Apple on TV. So we had Apple on TV. We hired Dick Cavett as a spokesman. He did the commercials, both radio and television. People don't realize that, but we did a fair amount of TV for them, and farmed out the production on all that. So Jay and I met at the Oak Room in New York City. We were both back there, and we shook hands on it. And it was on Friday the 13th. We said we'd do it, and that was it. I didn't talk. I had a lot of offers from most of the large agencies to buy me out, but I felt Jay would take care of the clients we had. He was capable of doing it. Not too many other agencies I knew would. And so the one criteria I had was, I do not want to save any of your clients. So when we signed the final deal, we did it on a Friday again up here. On Monday morning, all of the employees who are doing the advertising will show up at your offices. And that's what happened. So I never went back, never said, gee, here's I never went and had to explain anything or do anything. We just moved it. And then, but Jay and I then, on part of the money, we set it aside in a little kitty for investing in startups, which we did here. And because I had good friends at Sequoia and at Kleiner Perkins and a number of other of the venture firms, I was given opportunity to buy in as a special partner or a special investor, and so I would place that kitty's money with Jay, and we went on a couple boards together, and so we just remained friends over the years. He was really outstanding as a creative person.
Did he understand the technology business the way you understood it, Regis, or did you help introduce him to an understanding of what made it different and unique?
Well, Jay was first, he started in Orange County, and at the time he was known as an industrial ad agency. So most of his clients were industry or technology oriented. So I wouldn't say that he had deep knowledge of it, but it was really good because he was able to get through some of this outside the boundaries of specsmanship. Probably a lot more easier and with more credibility than I had. They sort of saw Jay as a creative, far out person.
And since he was based on the West Coast, did he have a kind of sensibility that people in the East didn't have?
Yes, that's absolutely true. He did eventually open an office in New York, and he went from Orange County. He merged with Guy Day, who had an ad agency in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, and so it became Chiat Day, and they grew, and but they had consumer accounts and they had technical accounts, and I think there was a certain attraction to being able to say, I think they handled the first Honda account, one of the automobile accounts. They did. They did the what was it? The ever-ready batteries, those kind of things. So they were on television a lot with their different ads, and they were always very creative. And before that, the one ad agency was Doyle Dane, who did the all white space and a whole ad, 2 pages, mostly white space and a little Volkswagen down here, those kind of things. And so they just had they were looked upon as something special.
Well, we've reached the end of the 70s now, and the next session will be all Apple and Steve Jobs. Anything else as we wrap up today?
No, I think that one last thing was that the 70s was really the beginning of the proliferation of technology companies here in the Valley. And I mentioned a number of our clients that I'm sure people have never heard of because they were outside that spectrum of semiconductors and even PCs. The industries didn't really talk to each other very much. And so when we talk about who was whom, there was certainly the stars within the semiconductor, there was the stars within the PC. Apple was the first one to have sort of a rock star that everybody knew because it was a consumer product. But companies like MeasureX, companies like Spectraphysics, Siliconics, these were all people who added to the font of knowledge and growth of the Valley through various means. While some of them didn't survive or were acquired or whatever, doesn't mean that the people who were educated at these companies by doing. There was one of the people that I really admired was a fellow who did Inside the Black Box by a fellow at Stanford, an economist at Stanford.
I have that in my notebook. I can't.
Yeah, I have them too. Boy, I'm terrible. I'm sorry on names, but
we'll edit it in.
Okay. But I got to know him and pretty well, and he talks about the fact that the thing that he wrote Inside the Black Box about is really an interesting conversation, because he described technology as sort of the Russian doll that you open one and there's another one and another one and another one. Yeah. That technology isn't linear, that you don't have a product and then you linearly just improve it. That if you improve it, there's a whole infrastructure of processes, technologies, in other aspects of it that have to improve. So if you improve the density of a chip, you have to improve the ability of testers to test that density. You have to improve the processes to create room for different kinds of movement of the electrons in different ways. And so that's been improving over line. It's always been an incredible thing. But everything has to move up for you to put that product out. It's not just a simple product. And so all of a lot of the ancillary kinds of technologies that were evolved came from companies in the Valley. And they had to be there. It's sort of part of the supply chain.
And that was a factor based on the companies you named in the growth of your company in the 70s, as all those other companies were coming on stream.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.